Okay. And we'll try it now. I think we're live. Yes, we're live. Okay. Good grief. Let's see. Okay. There's that. Alright. You're gonna sit there and look at me, guys. Come on. It's supposed to be a chat. Say something. Alright. Alrighty, come on. I can't tell how it's going if you guys don't say anything. Come on. Okay, well, thank you, Robert Pearson, for just saying something. Let's see. I'm beginning to wonder if maybe the computer is the weak link here, because I got an Ethernet connection plugged right into the damn computer, so there's no vagaries of Wi-Fi signal. It's, you know, it's plugged right into the wall. Okay, so I'm gonna have to wait until I actually get a real, a real big boy computer to do any decent live chats. So, and I can also finally learn how to use these other programs, the OBS and the Streamlabs. So much for getting back on Marioki with this setup. On the other hand, I can download stuff like a son of a gun here. I got all 4 seasons of Blake 7 last night in about 5 minutes. I think I might make sure I also got those making of extras. So, because in typical Microsoft fashion, it's like, there's errors, but don't tell me how to fix them or where to even start. So, yeah. Maybe if we go to a yeah. Let's see. Yes, remove it. Let's see. Let's see, just put it on still frame, see if that helps any. How's that helping? Just screw the picture. And now we're buffering. Okay. That should be going out. Yeah. Go for the resolution. Okay. It's saying good connection. Yeah. Let's see. I'm trying to do something just to get off the camera, just go with a still picture. So, let's see. I've dropped the thing as much as I can, I think. Yeah, I'm trying to... And I figure the Ethernet plug-ins and things like should be going right off the walls here, but and YouTube stuff by itself is just, not helping things. Yeah, no, it's not. All right. Listen, I'm trying to go to OBS to get off the damn camera. That didn't do anything. Yeah. Fine, whatever. More info is useless. Let's see. There we go. Let's see if this helps a bit. We're not going to have to worry about the camera. You're going to see why Doomcock does what he does. And his life just... Okay. As long as the audio is smooth, I don't care about the rest of it, because I'm not like I'm doing a full song and dance show here. Alright, so now that we got people talking, okay, what do you want to talk about, guys? Because we can talk Star Trek, or the lack thereof, we can talk the destruction of Doctor Who, we can talk how screwed up Star Wars is getting. I suggest we avoid politics, keep all concerned, but except in how they're trying to force it down our throats on our shows here. So, any questions? Any answers? Anybody like a mint? Whatever you want. Yeah, we're just gonna keep it on the still for a while because apparently it doesn't like the camera. I think even Ethernet needs something faster than this. What the hell? I did not do that. Get back in there. What are you doing? There. Keep that straight down here. Yeah. The resolution's the resolution is what it's gonna be. All right. Part of the problem is I don't do these often enough to remember how everything's set up, so it's kind of like discovering it all over again every time I do one of these suckers. Yeah. Clean. Yeah, I know they creep. Let's see. Stupid. So how's about I log in? Where's some of this? Hold on. Block that for now. Playing with Discord for a moment. Yeah, no shit. What the hell? Come on. Oh, God. This is why people don't like, Discord after a while. It's too much crap. That they that. Yeah. Alright, well, screw this. Get out of that. Okay, how's it going now? Because I got, both preview and the program is set on the same stupid picture, so. Man, I need to do a doom clock thing, start singing the old standards, Yeah, no, it's more info. More info is no info. Come on, don't tell me a damn thing. Let's see. Let's see. Fairy tales can come true. You can have. Alright, where's the Star Trek? Yeah, tell you what, if you notice, the last episode, when he's going in to meet the Admiral and the little holograms above, before we get the Enterprise D, we get the Disco Prize. So there's your rock solid link right there. This is the Discovery universe. It ain't the regular canon universe. They just happen to have gotten another Jean-Luc Picard and probably a similar Next Generation thing. And in universe, this kind of follows a theory that I got with all these parallel universes. They all try and follow along as best they can the main established timeline. And they'll try to course correct, and the timeline will try to course correct and line back up with the prime timeline. So you'll be able. Oh, give him time. Patrick Stewart has made a point that he wants to use this as his personal platform, and as far as like his head being turned by LA, no, he's always been a hardcore labor supporter. So he's been on the lefty side for a very long time. And this is back in England when socialist was not necessarily a bad word. Okay, they had a very active socialist party for a long time, and the labor has really gone that way of recent years. But the thing is, that's also why they got shellacked in the last general election. A big thing was they were doing again to block Brexit, despite saying in their manifesto that they would honor the referendum, to the point where they didn't like it. But yeah, and they're getting a little too whole thing because that when they had said I never understood sci-fi. It's like that wasn't Jean-Luc Picard. That was Patrick Stewart, because he's not a big sci-fi fan, despite having worked in it for a good chunk of his career. And I think it could probably appeal to his sense of things like, a lot of Shakespeare, is kind of bordering on fantasy, and you have to kind of stretch the imagination for that. So, and Dickens also, because, because My Christmas Carol is bordering on on a horror show, horror movie right there, a horror story. Because ghosts visiting in the middle of the night and taking them different places in time. Like I imagine, in order to get his own mind around it, he probably had to thought about the last Next Gen episode, All Good Things, as kind of Picard's Christmas Carol. But he's been an outspoken lefty type anyway for a long time. In fact, he was talking about when the cast visited the White House or something, and talking about how I'm just amazed at him, hard, long core labor supporter, and yet when President Bush walked by, he started waving like a little girl, so he just couldn't resist. So my big thing is, again, they're going to try and force the politics in no matter what. the problem is they're trying to use Bruce Maddox as a Trump stand-in. It's like, how does that even work? How can you possibly make a cyberneticist and robotics expert? I just checked the fucking resolution. Come on, stop that. All right. Okay, how we doing? How about now? Oh. Okay. I'm going to keep on talking to her. Okay, sounds about okay. All right, so where did it go weird? And it's like, okay, that's good. We're picking up. Send out the call. Call in your friends. Okay, we're going now. I dropped the resolution to like 720 something. So yeah, there's no moving picture going on, so it's just a still image. So, damn it! I did not do that. Stop it. Yeah, whatever. Okay. This thing cannot make up its mind. Well, as long as the sound is coming through, I'm not going to worry too much about it. But all right. Let's see. Mic is still active on there. So okay. Get this thing out of my damn picture. Come on. Okay. How's this going? I'll turn that. Yeah, deal with them. Okay. How's this going? It's got a serious delay on this thing. Probably gotta drop the resolution a little more, so hold on here. Yeah, get out of the way. Come on. Okay, let's try this again here. Drop things down a little more. Well, what the fuck is optimal? God damn it! Come on. Instead of telling me what's it's not optimal. Tell me what is optimal, you piece of crap. All right. Okay, how are we going now here? Okay, how are we going now here? Mic seems a bit loud. All right. And we got a nice little echo too. Get rid of that. Okay. Okay, so like I said, guys, I need feedback here so I know what's happening, because I can't tell much about here. These error messages are about as informative as mud. Okay, that's progress. Alright, so we're just gonna go. I'm just gonna go with the still images for now until I get a real computer that I can actually do some real video with. But I guess remember to do that. Another warning about the damn video resolution. Who cares? It's a still picture. Okay. Well, yeah, I dropped the resolution, so it should be a little grainy. So. But, okay, so. Another thing I expect to crop up at some point is because Patrick Stewart's also been very big about Amnesty International for a lot of years, which is to be applauded, except when they try and tell the United States that we're doing things, but buffering again. Jesus Christ, what the hell? Yes, at this point I should point out these super chats are active here, so you can help me get real equipment and so I can start putting money into the channel and getting some real stuff, so I'm not dealing with this, Chinese-made Tinker Toy that keeps going weird on me here. Well, yeah, the image is going to be a still image. I'm not doing the camera anymore because that just clogs things up. So, well, there should be some sound going out. Tell you what, I am going to find some background noise so I can at least get some constant sound here, not wait for me to say something. Okay. Sound effects. Okay. Let's see how this goes. Come on, give me the skip. Bye. There. All right, get that out of the way. Okay. Turn that down to the few hairs there. Okay. Should be hearing bridge sounds. Well, now what? Come on. Come on. Okay. Okay. All right. Okay, folks, or folk in this case. All right. How's the bridge sounds coming through? Okay. Well, I can probably bring that up a little bit. There we go. All right. Now I'm getting buffering. Okay. Hold on. Okay. Nope, wrong one. Oh, I'm gonna get back over there. Okay, how's this going? Because I'm playing for my YouTube thing, so it's occasionally buffering on me on that one. So. And it's an 8-hour track, so I don't have to worry about it running out on me. Alright, let's see. Occasionally buffering on me on that one, so. Okay, let's start. So, we've established that Patrick Stewart is a hardcore lefty buddy of Jeremy Corbyn and is not happy with Brexit, so wham, he's probably loving life now because his homeland is now a free country whether he likes it or not. So, and we got 4 people sitting here looking at me, looking at my picture, or a modified picture. Any other subjects, or we should continue ragging on Patrick Stewart? Yeah, good. Oh, whatever. Yeah. All right. Come on, guys. It's a chat. It means back and forth. Come on, I'm just gonna monologue and just doing video, not to worry about all these, drop frames and stuff. I mean, I got a still frame and I got bridge noises going, so it's not gonna change much. So unless you guys, give me something to talk about. I'll tell you what, I just took a look at the Star Wars Underworld thing they did there, and the review that Rob and... Okay, yeah, I think Chibnall has finally broken it. Especially when he doubled out. No, she's really the doctor. He's like, really? You're putting someone in a corner there. Because Chibs is like, even if they double back and declare she's a alternate timeline doctor. Oh yeah. Yeah, cultural vandal. Like I'm not sure if I coined the term cultural locus or picked it from somewhere else, but yeah, that's why they move in, pick one to the bone, and move on to the next one. Star Trek is a creation of TV, and that's really where it belongs, because it's not really set up for movies. Have to be the biggest thing ever to justify being in a movie, and that's where JJ think, oh yeah, and he blew up Romulus and Vulcan. The problem is, if you're doing a series, even a series of movies, you can't shoot your wad like that, because then it's like, well, what do you do for an encore? As in, what do you do for the sequel? And when you blow up 2 of the main planets in Star Trek history, it's like, well, what are you gonna do next? Blow up Earth? You gotta know where to go really quick. And he did the same thing with in Force Awakens. You want Death Star? I'll give you an entire planet at the Death Star, and I'll blow up 5 planets at once. And yeah, okay. You really want to shoot your wad this early? That's that. People grab about the Phantom Menace, about how slow and kind of forget the whole thing. It's supposed to be episode 1. It's supposed to build up to episode 4. So yeah, the first one's not going to be that big a deal. It's gonna, because if you haven't seen it for a while, go back and watch them in order from episode 1, at least through episode 4, and you'll see they flow right into one into the next. I think a lot of it's also because people forget how young they were when they first saw the first Star Wars movie compared to how old they were when they saw Force Awakens. Oh yeah, it was a sizzle reel for a Star Wars gig. So it's, oh no, I can't do it. Yeah. Meanwhile, look at my movie. And, yeah, sure, JJ. You know. Yeah. Well, I'll take as far as taking a spray can to a print of a Van Gogh. Fine, do what you want with it. But you go to an actual Van Gogh and then start, doing that. No, you don't. You know. And the sad thing is, this guy they brought in, Hockey or whatever, Holly, he was making all the right noises. He was, you got to respect the fans and the lore that came up to it. I mean, you do something new within that, but you have to respect the lore. And he's like, yes, this is the guy we should have had all along. Okay, Trek Guards is not that bad. Trek Guards, thing is, Stuart and Samuel are ship guys, and they approach it from that angle. The personal views, actually, Stuart's a little closer to me on that respect. He's saying it's not the same universe. There's no way it can be the same universe. And he's really not a fan of Discovery, as far as the story. The stories, he recognizes the stories are stupid. The science is idiotic. And Samuel especially will go after things that I've gone after on ship design stuff. So they're trying to be as diplomatic as possible and looking at it from the angle of they're just doing the ships. How plausible are these ship designs? And even then, when they're doing Discovery stuff, it's like this, I suppose if you do this and this, you could kind of possibly maybe explain it. And they bend themselves into curlicue sometimes, trying to excuse some of this crap. But even with the new version of the D7, they still kind of it's still kind of oversized. It's like So they're the fair-minded ones, but they still tend to fall, within vicinity of the Phantom Menace. I mean, there are respectable ones we send out to talk to the people, whereas me and Rob and Tom and Mecca, and it's like we're the surly ones that throw stones. It's like Now, what I'm a little, I don't know why I'm buffering here. What I was a little disturbed at was this one thing, and I'm still working on the response video to this, but it's a triangulum audio something. What are the stuffs buffering? Okay, yeah, this triangulum audio thing where he does the analysis of the ships. It's very good work. Yeah. Okay, John Eves is really kind of at the mercy of the people calling the shots. When they're in that kind of position, you really can't do your own thing there. You got to do what they tell you. So, art director, because Ryan Church's original ideas for the Enterprise for JJ weren't that bad. But JJ's got his own ideas. It looked like a hot rod. It's like a military vessel looked like a hot rod. Right. But look at some of Ryan Church's earlier conception work, and it's a lot closer in line to the original series. So yeah, John Eves, he's doing what he can. He's one of the few actual Star Trek veterans on the entire staff. Not just art, but writing. He's the only one there I know that actually worked on Star Trek proper. And he probably had to fight to get the Enterprise as close as it was. Because first thing they had when even Brian Fuller was still in charge was no cylindrical nacelles. Everything with these boxy things. So I'll cut the design staff a little bit of slack on the fact that they're kind of at the mercy of what the producers say. The writing and producers stuff, they get no mercy from me though, because they're the ones making these stupid decisions. I like Rob Burnett's thing about Kirsten Beyer must go home and cry herself to sleep at night with what they're doing to Star Trek, and she can't do anything about it except try and keep it from going totally off the rails. But I think also as far as The new, I mean, Picard show, it's like, well, well, they went a little more than 25%, just probably just to be safe. So it's like at least 25% different. But I think a lot of it, as far as Picard goes, with the same ships showing up, I think it's because they blew the budget so badly. And actually, a lot of it was Discovery siphoned off a lot of the Picard budget in order just to get finished, so the Picard had no money left. And they blew a lot of that just doing what they can, and with reshoots. And the ones Shaban worked on was paying licensing fees to incorporate some actual Star Trek into it, like the Enterprise D, like that comm badge, and stuff like that. And getting the actual original uniforms, like that Nemesis. Well, first contact, style uniform for Data, and the one seen in 10 forward, and then also the next gen uniforms that seen in the field. They had to pay CBS that license fee for that. No, I don't think Andy Probert would, because he would, he would kind of balk. I don't know. Well, maybe he would, depending on, But Andy Probert and Rick Sternbach, no, I don't think they would put up with it. But John Eves managed to survive JJ, because at the original for the first JJ Trek movie, it was John Eves and Jeff Mandel. And they shit-canned Jeff Mandel because he had a chart done up comparing, the size comparison between the original ship and the JJ Prize. He got shit-canned for that because apparently they do attach to the old ship. And he's learned right then and there keep his mouth shut so he could keep his job. Yeah. And yeah, that's why I thought these guys got to work, and they're at the mercy of the idiots in charge. So I direct the ire at the head of the snake, not the rattle. Yeah. But I'm just, apparently, it's coming that there actually have been some discussions. It's not just a rumor. There have been discussions between CBS, Viacom CBS, and NBC Universal about buying Star Trek, with Zach MacFarlane involved, and they're wanting too much money for it right now. So Seth and them walked out of the talks because nope, not at that price. Because right now it's like, well, the JJ price blows the proportions. Because one of the things that works for the when they settled on the original Enterprise, and imagine it was a trial and error thing because you look at the original sketches, but they had to fall into it until it looked right. There is a certain ratio of this to this part to that part, and eventually it falls in. It's sort of and it bears out through classical art, whatever, but a certain golden ratio. And the Enterprise falls into that. The saucer's just the right size, the nacelles the right size or right length, everything's spaced out right, so it looks evenly balanced. And the JJ Prize blows that out of the saucer's too big, the nacelles are too close together and misshapen. And the whole thing is too far back on the secondary hull. It just blows a portion and trying to make it like a hot rod. It's like, fine if it was a civilian vessel, but it's not. I mean, people complain about the Enterprise being from the 60s. What is there about the original Enterprise that says anything about the 60s? Other than maybe the lights and the Bussard collectors. Because everything else of that looks like it was designed, frankly, in the 1940s for the U.S. Navy. It's very, utilitarian, block angles, I mean, part of that is probably because of the construction, because the struts are essentially 2x4s. Well, you do kind of get a sailing ship's effect with the saucer and the thing. Next gen, it's in the writer's guide, I think, but the era was supposed to be technology unchained, where you could get a ship that did the job done, but also looked nice too. So that's why you got the Enterprise D with the big sweeping, curves and stuff. And because this is not a ship that's really necessary to intimidate. It's like go out there and hey, this is nice. Yeah. These people look friendly. That's the idea there. But then once, the Borg and other things, like time to get back to making, ships that say, yeah, don't mess with us. And then you get the Sovereign class and the Defiant and other, Yeah, I'm still, part of me wants to get, just to have it, some example of a JJ Prize. I've got a couple of Hot Wheels ones with, that I still haven't taken out of the package. I can't now, they're back in storage, but I got them in because they're still on the peg for like 89 cents. It's like, okay, I'll spend a couple of bucks on it, but I'm not gonna go nuts on things. 1 to 1.6. I'm guessing that was the I don't know, the ratio or something. But once upon a time, Universal did have a Star Trek thing. I actually took part in one. I went with the Hollywood one. I was hoping to get on the bridge crew for that, but no, I ended up being assigned the engineer that goes die young. I had the great honor of bravely dying on stage in the arms of some Swedish girl, and time on screen in the Hoover video was like a half a second, so I didn't bother getting the video. But I had the big engineering coverall suit and some black on my face, like a conduit just blew up in front of me. But that was fun. Then occasionally you see some of these outfits from that thing crop up on eBay or whatever. But actually, that's something that if NBC does get the rights, basically gets the rights back, because originally with the original show they did have the rights on this thing. When is Kurtzman again? Shit can't not soon enough. That's the thing. And and apparently I think Yellow Flash did a thing. There's other people come up with. Managed to ferret out some indications of, because again, CBS is not giving any viewing numbers. They're not saying anything about how the show is really doing. Because it's the most watched original show. Well, you have very few original shows. A lot of it's reruns or current programming on CBS itself. Oh yeah, those 60 sets hold up perfectly well. You light them right, and you put a little more detail on them than what you had back in the 60s, because you're now in a high def world. And those sets work fine. The design works fine, But yeah, they managed to ferret out some indications of the viewership, and the viewership of Picard is dropping off a cliff. They showed it for the first episode, not so much in the second, and it's just it's nosediving at this point. And from what I understand, the things go really off the rails by episode 4. So they probably not coming back, and this may finally be the last straw that gets Sherry Redstone to say, "That's it, you're done. We are not bankrupting the network because of your little power fantasies and your griping and your grudging against Star Trek fans. They want to destroy the franchise in the process." Well, yeah, that may be a thing. Yeah, make it look like a cheap toy in China, so it can be a cheap toy from China. Oh, and also about those sets, because I've been on the sets in Kingsland, and for Star Trek Continues, twice. Okay, so those sets they're fine. Okay, yeah, in person you can see the wood grain, and you can see and you can tell these switches don't really do anything in the little toggle switches you can take off the vote, because they only had so many. We could shift around from set to set. But on camera, it doesn't matter. You put in some sound effects and everything, and like what we're doing right now with sound effects. And it's no longer a warehouse in Kingsland, Georgia. It's now the bridge of the Enterprise. Oh yeah. The screwy thing is, the Discovery toys that McFarlane Toys was going to put out, then didn't. Because they made excuses. Oh, look, too much like a real weapon. There's too many regulations. It's bull crap. Okay, nobody wanted them, or at least not. Frankly, I kind of wanted one of those phasers, because the phasers actually aren't that bad looking. They don't fit the period within a light year of it, but they're neat little design though. And I figured it's like there's more than one kind of semi-automatic pistol these days, so there should be more than one kind of phaser. You know, not everything has to look exactly like the ones we see on the security guard's hip. And I like the fact that they drug out the old hand lasers once in a while. You know, it's like, you know, they'll still be used. People still use like old guns today. You know. So I don't mind, you know, a variety of different weapons. Yeah. But yeah, and something I'm going to address when my response to the Triangulum video about, you know, and it basically addresses the fandom medicine, the haters, and whatever. He won't tell me who he talked to amongst the fandom menace, supposedly, but you know, I talked to. It's like, yeah, who did you talk to? Because the charges he makes is like, that's not anybody I know in the fandom menace. We don't do that kind of. We don't belittle people because they like this guy. In fact, quite the opposite. If you like it, fine. Here's why we don't like it and why it needs to be stopped. You know. But no one's saying don't enjoy it if you enjoy it, you know. But don't try and push it on us as like this is the way to go. Because actually, the real negativity comes from the ones who do support. You're just old and you need to go away and die, you know. Just, you know, consign us old fans off to the iceberg somewhere because we can enjoy Star Trek. The thing is, the people who will enjoy it are flighty little, you know, mayfly types that, you know, they're on to the next trend, you know. That's why JJ Trek burned out. That's a big reason right there, because you pissed off the old fans. The ones you had, oh yeah, I'm not a fan of the F-bombs. Well, there's a way to do it. Like, yeah, you can have characters swear like sailors within the Star Trek universe, but not among Starfleet, and certainly not among the Admiralty. For God's sakes. And, you know, the irony is the actress who played the Admiral played a Enterprise crew member on Next Gen back in the day. Yeah. That's the thing. It's like, by the 23rd century, it's like they really weren't doing that kind of thing. They weren't cussing up the stars for the most part. Now, again, I can see, you know, certain individuals here and there with certain little cultural backgrounds that probably still, you know, swear up and down because they still knew how to swear, sort of. I mean, double dumbass in you was still kind of a bit awkward, but, you know, Kirk could still come up with you. Turn that damn noise down. But it wasn't common parlance, you know. I mean, the most of it is, you know, you damn it in hell and everything, but yeah, but if you look and let's see, it'll be the next gen episode, The Emissary, I guess, where Kalar first shows up. And the still frame I saw is like from the bridge where Worf is in full Klingon regalia, and that other Klingon ship, the Tong, everyone has just woken up and opened fire on the Enterprise. And they get a cute little idea. It's like, okay, put, you know, Worf and Kalar in full Klingon regalia. So they open up a channel. Captain Kadewar, have you gone mad? And so they see Worf, the helmsman on the side there in the red shirt. That's the guy who's playing the Admiral. So it kind of makes you wonder, okay, this, if you want to do the old thing of tie everyone together, everyone who played parts, you know, they're all the same person or something, or they're related. You know, did she just shoot past Picard in rank, and now she's got a great beef against her old captain? You know, but that, you know, that's silly. It always has been silly, Frank. People turn on twist their knots trying to make Nurse Chaplin #1 related. You know, and it's like actor John Lormer. He played Theodore Haskins in the Cage, or the survivors on Talos 4. He played one of the guys on, you know, one of the guys on Return to the Archons, and Tamar, I don't know what, one of the old guy who gets blasted by the lawgivers, and then he played one of the Fabrini guys, and when you know for the world's all that touch sky. They're not related, okay? They just like his work, and they brought him back a few times. So. Oh yeah, and a big click, you know, introducing Star Trek. The Orville is in Star Trek's is in Gene Roddenberry's vision, and actually they've done a better job of explaining it than Star Trek itself ever did. Yeah, the Orville's it. Yeah, and that's why. Oh God, no! Please, Seth MacFarlane get control of Star Trek. I was in favor of that back when he did a interview with the Hollywood Reporter back around 2010, and they asked him what he wanted to do next. He wanted to do Star Trek. He really wanted to do Star Trek because you need to do some proper uplifting science fiction and emphasis on the science. And yes, he gets it. You know, he understands it. Let him at it. And apparently, when CBS was bringing people in to do pitches for Star Trek, MacFarlane came in, and my understanding is the Orville was his pitch. It would have been a lower level Starfleet ship, and these guys were, and they didn't want to go with it, and they went with the Orville. They went with the Discovery instead. Alrighty, I mean, no, it's coming. Well, yeah, well, even Patrick Stewart said, this is the show you want to binge at the end of the whole thing. It's like, okay, that's not what you're supposed to tell them, Patrick. You're supposed to tell them you want to tune in every week, but this is really a slow build up, and it's on a foundation of crap. Because while they have slightly changed the circumstances of Romulus's destruction, it's no longer the Hobus, whatever the hell it was, threatening to take on half the galaxy, and Romulus was the first one hit. No, it's just the Romulan star went supernova. And even the Admiral's explanation, we had about 5 years ago. They would have known about it for thousands of years, okay? When a star is going to go supernova, you know it, okay? One, you can tell just by the mass of the star what the ultimate fate of that star is going to be. You can plan. Yeah, it's eventually going to go supernova. But in between time, when it's between the time it's just a regular main sequence star and a go boom boom, there is a long period of time, thousands upon thousands of years, probably millions of years, where it turns into a red giant. Then it contracts and goes boom. And they're skipping over all that, hoping. On one hand, maybe hoping the audience isn't that smart, but I think the big thing is they're not that smart. They probably have not done any research into what happens when a star is about to go supernova. And as far, any more than they did in the J.J. Trek movie when they had that Hopus supernova thing. Supernovas happen every day, and the fact is we kind of need them to happen because that's where all of our heavier elements come from. They're the product of what was, again, it's part of, watching the original Nova, they go through this. Because whenever a star collapses, it forces the helium, hydrogen, hydrogen into helium is just part of the process. And eventually when things, various stars collapse, it'll force them into like iron and harder, heavier elements. A supernova causes the pressure where you get all the the heavier stuff, gold, uranium, every element in the book, heavier than iron, is formed in a supernova. I think NBC might eventually get a piece of it. I'm not so sure that Sherry Redstone is going to sell off Star Trek outright. But I can see them kind of jointly owning it a bit. And there's with maybe Seth getting a production deal similar to Alex Kurtzman. Yeah, we drop F-bombs. That's all they got to go by right now. And we got Patrick Stewart. Yeah, well, you think Seth MacFarlane couldn't get Patrick Stewart with a single phone call? They have a very good working relationship between Family Guy and not Family, and American Dad. There was a regular, and other things. So you could get Patrick Stewart like that. That would not be a problem. But yeah, and again, that little battle they had between the Union fleet and the Kazon. Oh yes. That's so edgy. Klingon corpse babe, the Klingon, babe raping a white guy, and a little dead baby head. Yeah, that's maturity. Yeah. Oy, 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 oy. My big thing is the Klingon makeup. It's a little too extensive, not just in the face, but you get the naked Klingon. It's like, she looks like it's an autopsy. The thing's going looks like an autopsy scar. You know. There's nothing titillating about that at all. You know. Yeah, Beetlejuice eventually go 5,000 years. You get thousands of years warning, to the extent that when the people we eventually would call Romulans left Vulcan, I'm not so sure they would settle on a planet in a system that was eventually going to go supernova. And you would be able to tell, yes, this star will eventually go supernova. We might want to locate somewhere else. You know. Oh yeah. Big in USA, but elsewhere, Oh yeah. Well, the big thing is, how they expect to, they're not going to get the reach if it's a mature audience's show. And that's the thing. As I keep citing over and over again to kind of boost up my bona fide, I was watching the show originally with my dad when I was like 2 or 3 years old, because that's when it was on NBC. I was like, I was 2.5 when the show premiered. And the most offensive thing they ever said was, Sydney is forever, and Kirk said, "Let's get the hell out of here." I mean, granted, that was a pretty shocking thing for 1967. Because back then they really, you wonder how they got away with it, except the fact that by then they were finishing episodes the week they aired. So it's like, okay, don't, and they didn't have a chance to review it. So the first time the network heard it was like when it aired. So I imagine there was probably a phone call or two from Burbank, and it's like, "What the hell are you putting on our airways, Roddenberry?" It's like, "What? You can't. It's not a big deal." It also may have been one of those things where there was no specific prohibition against it, just like, we don't like you using that kind of language, but once in a while we'll let it slide this one time, Roddenberry. But yeah, that doesn't work, okay? Because again, you can tell just by the mass of a star what's going to happen to it. Like, and yeah, they went into this in Cosmos. Sagan pointed out that stars of a certain mass will do this, certain other mass, and like, a star just 1.5 times more massive than our sun. That's where you go, where it's going to go supernova. Not might, not may, but will. Because because we know what happens to stars when they start getting older, use up their fuel. They blow it out into red giants, and then there's usually shrink down into white dwarfs or brown dwarfs and go cold. But with just a little bit, where the mass isn't quite big enough to do this, but it's in the middle ground, it's not entirely stable. And as such, when it starts going to the red giant phase, it just collapsing down, the numbers are just off enough that it will collapse too far and go supernova. The supernova happens in seconds, but the process that leads up to it takes millennia. So, and it can be predicted just by looking at the star, reading the mass, and yeah, that's what's going to happen. Well, also if they're changing out to the Romulan supernova, not the Hobus thing, because the Hobus thing is a complete and utter bullshit. Because they're talking about supernova that threaten the galaxy. Impossible. Certainly, if you're talking a supernova, supernovas don't do that. Okay, the only threat the supernova poses is to its own star system. Well, yeah, they've already they can't even keep their own canon straight, because when they're setting this thing up for Picard, it's like they're talking the Romulan supernova. Well, then it really wasn't following on from JJ's wreck, because that wasn't a Romulan supernova. That was something else that went bloom and caused everything else to go screwy. So I think they just don't know what the hell they're talking about. I think he probably may have forgotten. He thought it was a Romulan supernova. Well, it was a Hobus thing. You wrote the thing. What the hell is it? So. But, you know, this kind of gets into the thing of, you know, why Andy Trekker sort of officially distanced himself from being in the Phantom Menace, because you start going after like JJ and Kurtzman. It's like they're hacks. No, they are hacks. They are total hacks because they manage to hide it so because they steal from the best, you know. But it is largely just, you know, cut and paste here. Okay, we'll do a Michael Bay thing here with a slow motion walk around the explosion, and we'll do a, you know, a Spielberg bit here, and then do a, you know, borrow a little Scorsese over here, you know. But it's all cut and paste, you know. It's like that, you know, scene on the bridge of the Kelvin as this is strictly copying Michael Bay. It's all slow motion explosions, and it's like, you know, this is nothing earth shattering here. Except the fact that they're, you know, now having, you know, Kirk born in space instead of Iowa. Well, apparently CBS or Secret had, at least, if you let it slip that you're a Star Trek fan, you won't get hired. In fact, I suspect if you tell them you never like Star Trek and think it's stupid, you'll probably get a story editor job. Yeah. There's something. I'm beginning to wonder. You know, they're starting to wonder. It's like, does Alex Kurtzman have something personal against Star Trek? It's like he's deliberately trying to destroy the franchise, because that's what it seems like. Because it seems like it's just a personal grudge he's got against. I don't know. Maybe a Star Trek fan, you know, stole his lunch one day at school. I don't know. Well, that, you know, and the little shooting stars in deep space. It's like these people are, you know, scientifically illiterate. You know. In fact, let me bring the sounds down a bit, because I want to see if I can dig up something here. I want to pull up that Isaac Asimov interview. Let's see. There we go. Let's get away from the porno files. No quicksand porn in my collection, though. I know of it. I kind of know how it works, but I'm not into it. No. Too much like Bond. So, all right. Where did I put it? Actually, no, that's not what I want. Here we go again. It's buffering. There we go. All right. Let's see. Actually, there we go. And artifacts, I think. Okay, now which side had the, yeah. Asimov was on. He was on the pack too. Yeah. Let's see. Okay. Okay.
Network physics.
All right.
Say when we talked recently.
Well, yes, of course.
That's with D. Kelly.
Any so-called and meet the diversity that's all. Isaac Asimov came over and
Okay.
and said you're quite right.
That's it.
Background by appropriate changes in the level of science and technology.
You've written someone of
Okay.
my most favorite questions, science fiction.
Okay. That's it.
The man that congratulations, you've just insulted Isaac Asimov.
Well, let's just play for a while.
Remember that incident, Ike?
No, I don't, but it rings true because I'm always talking.
Well, the point
Yeah.
of it I remember is after the show was over, the man that
A little
I had always wanted
Gene
to
Roddenberry and
my idol in science fiction,
Isaac Asimov.
came over and apologized and said, "You're quite right. I shouldn't have been talking."
Back.
And then said some nice things about the pilot.
Let's go and pause that for.
Sort of a long friendship. Here's probably one of the oldest questions that, to you: what is science fiction?
Well, I don't know that
Well, like 19 producers actually.
I'm really an expert on this, despite the fact I've written a great many books. But I've always said that science fiction is that branch of literature which deals with the response of human beings to changes in science and technology. Now that's a rough and ready description of science fiction, but a lot of people ask me, how do I differentiate science fiction from fantasy? That's the second most favorite question among science fiction people.
Let's see.
And to my way of thinking, that although science fiction and fantasy both deal with a background which is completely different from the normal background that exists today, in fantasy there is no way in which we can travel from our background to the fantastic background, which may involve magic, elves, fairies,
With the Star Trek Discovery background.
but we can at least conceivably travel from our background to the science fictional background by appropriate changes in the level of science and technology.
Mm-hmm.
You've written some 110 books, perhaps more. Is the Foundation the one you'd like to be remembered for, or is it another one?
I think the Foundation trilogy is, whether I like it or not, the one I'm going to be most nearly remembered for. That is, if I'm remembered at all. My own favorite science fiction book is The Gods Themselves. In my non-fiction, I presume Asimov's Guide to Science is the most nearly famous book I've written.
I actually got a copy of that.
That is, it goes out of date unless I continually keep updating it.
It's the one that I've used most, and in the making of Star Trek, it sat on
Oh yeah, yeah.
a desk most of the time. I think you've seen more new writers happen, new science fiction writers, than most have. How about a quick course?
Here's where Asimov becomes a prophet.
What are the most common mistakes you think are made in the field?
Well, from my standpoint, the most common mistake a science fiction writer makes is to downgrade science. Now, these days particularly, many science fiction writers have very little to do with science, and many science fiction stories have very little to do with science. But whether a science fiction story has science or not, it is impossible to write a good one if you are completely ignorant of science.
Bingo.
You will make mistakes even when you think science isn't involved. I think that it is important to at least know something about science, whether you're going to put science in or not. It shows. As a matter of fact, that's what makes the difference between Star Trek and all the other science fiction series that I have seen. Star Trek was the only one when whoever it was who was involved, Gene, and I mention no names, insisted on people knowing something about science and preparing and it showed, you know. You could see that even when you broke the laws of science, you were doing it intelligently and plausibly. There are other science fiction shows, no names please,
Discovery,
in
Picard.
which it is quite clear that the writers and the producer know nothing about science and don't care, and that shows too, and it is impossible to be a self-respecting viewer and accept it.
Well, you're not saying
And that is why we fight, people. That is why we do this, because it is impossible to be a self-respecting viewer and just swallow this crap. You know? Oh yeah, there's like between executive producers there, pushing 20. And this one is like, but once you figure, they had let's see, 5 writers and 21 producers. Most of them executive producers. Most TV shows of any genre have 1, maybe 2 executive producers, and then a couple of line producers. One handles the writers, one handles the budget. This is the first time I've ever seen any show have enough executive producers to form a football team with a few backups. This is ridiculous. And they wonder why it's so disjointed, why nothing, they're constantly rewriting it. Nobody's in charge. They're all given executive. It's like too many chiefs, not enough Indians. Yeah, I think red letter media is really doing. They're doing God's work over there. Especially in their assessment of the Picard thing. It's just sad. It's going a biannual funeral for Star Trek. Yeah. And even they touched on the fact, okay, Martian atmosphere is like mostly carbon, 95% carbon dioxide. That's a fire suppressant. How the hell is that going to burn? Okay. I think all the indications are they've not done any terraforming on Mars, so that, so this whole thing, the upper atmosphere is still burning. How? That's the one thing they forget about Star Trek, viewers, Star Trek fans. Like, we ask the questions, how does that happen? Explain this. They don't just, okay, and move on. No, it doesn't work that way. And then I keep bringing up the thing Roddenberry always said that Star Trek fans are born with a typewriter in one hand and a roll of stamps in the other. As in, yeah, we write letters and we send them. We will make our concerns known, to all and one and all. But I'm not sure if what Rod does there anymore. It's just I kind of like is in a way having like Rick Starbuck and Michael Kuda on there to figure out the science made the writing a little lazy, because they had to at least have some idea what they were doing in the old show, even though it was wrong at the time, and but they did have to work around it and figure it out and run it through a few mills. And apparently Devil in the Dark, the original idea for the Horde, it wasn't silicon. Like Kellen DeForce, I didn't remember what it was, but it was wrong, whatever it was, and so they had to go and science, go into things. So what is the theory? Well, there's a theory about silicon could work. Okay, we'll go with silicon. That works anyway, because then it makes it more of a rock creature. But as part of the thing, it's like the writers on these things are not. Well, let's look them up. Let's call up IMDb here. And let's look at the backgrounds of some of these idiot writers they got. Because in a way, Michael Chabon really doesn't count because he's been pretty much forced out. He's off doing his own. He's going to finally do an adaptation of his own book. Cavalier and Clay. I have the book. I haven't read it yet. Let's see. Let's look at Star Trek Picard. It's like the only writer in that whole packet that has anything close to actual Star Trek writing experience is Kirsten Beyer, and that's novels. And novels really don't count because they have different demands. Writing a prose novel, you don't have to worry about budget or getting to the point. I think you spend 15 pages just explaining something. There's something I'm a little irritated about. Nerdrotic has his own IMDb page. Dave Cullen, A Computer Forever, has one. Doomcock has his own IMDb page. Mecca and Anna have their own, and Mary they all have their own IMDb pages. Why am I not? Did I get an IMDb page up? Well, does not really count until I get over get over 5,000 subscribers. Okay, let's. What the hell? Get out of here! I don't want that. Get out of the way. I don't need a damn promo on it. No. Okay, full cat. No, not gonna do. Okay, writing credits. Let's say Kirsten Beyer. We know about that. She's written apparently very good books. But Michael Chabon, All right, they're citing Gene Roddenberry for 10. They're probably getting, Roddenberry's probably cited so they can, get away with a few crap. Because I don't know. Because Jean-Luc Picard is in it, and they're using stuff that he created. That's it. None of these stories. He would fire the lot of them. Okay, James Duff. What has he written? This guy wrote one episode. And his big thing is The Closer and Major Crimes, which is really the same show, just changed the title. And Doing Time on Maple Drive, that was a domestic drama. Yeah, Major Crimes, The Closer, which was a good show, by the way, but yeah. All right, he wrote the episode Fortunate Son for Enterprise. So at least that's something. He wrote something. I'm forgetting, what was that episode about? Okay. Okay, it's when they're answering the disc calls in the cargo freighter Fortunate. Attacked by Nausicaans. I vaguely remember this one. Yeah. Alright. Alright, yeah, LeVar Burton directed it. Alright. Alright, that was a decent one. So I wonder which one he wrote on this one. Let's see, Nick Zayas. What has he written prior to coming to Picard? Major Crimes. Okay. And that's it. He was a story writer on Major Crimes. And that's all he's done. That is his entire writing resume is 2 credits. He was a production assistant on 10 movies. He was a grip cinematographer on a short film. Set construction on another short. And he got special thanks on one thing. Oh, and he has 2 credits as an actor in TV short, a TV series, No Place to Fall, whatever the hell that was. But this is who's now, actually he's executive story editor. They have a story editor, believe it or not. Yeah. Okay, and Kurt's movie, about Craig, and let's see. Yeah, it's just, or as you go over to Discovery, it's chock full of former Gilmore Girls writers. That's not an exaggeration. Well, I haven't seen The Expanse, so I can't say to that. Although I think they're probably thinking more Total Recall. Yeah, part of the thing is the whole thing. We want to make it relevant. Okay, the second you make it relevant, you put you put an expiration date on it, because what's relevant now will not be relevant in 5 years. And that's why it's idiotic to try make a direct analogy to Brexit and Orange Man bad thing, because again, in a few years, nobody's going to give a rat's ass about that. Britain is planned to be completely out of the EU and within, let's say, a month or so, if nothing goes weird. And the current kerfuffle over, president is going to be gone too, because they've already said no witnesses. They'll be acquitted by next week, if that long. Probably I would do the vote Sunday. Who knows? But that's part of the thing of why the other shows have lasted, because they didn't try to be relevant to the times they were in. They address certain issues, but there are also certain issues that pretty much plague every era. They're constants. So yeah, the original series talked about they alluded to the Vietnam War, but in the sense of war is bad in general. And they didn't specifically focus on Vietnam. The closest they got was a private little war. And again, Kirk is essentially arguing in favor of engagement, because they had to stay in there in order to maintain both sides. I mean, the balance of power argument. But you'll never see anything on there about never see a Star Trek equivalent of them going after LBJ or any other specific 1960s. The closest they got really was the way to eat and deal with hippies, and that has aged badly. That because they're talking about the hippies, and it's like, okay, wait, you had your hippie episode. Now you've just firmly planted the show in the late 1960s. And well, the Enterprise incident kind of took inspiration from the Pueblo incident in '67. It didn't do a direct parallel of it, because actually that was rather horrific. I suggest tracking down that one. There's a TV movie, or actually, they were doing plays. ABC did back in early '70s, called Pueblo, with Hal Holbrook, and it details the capture of the Pueblo, which is a spy ship, by North Korea, and what they went through. They still have the Pueblo anchored in the North Korean harbor there. And I think, the ultimate solution to some, treaty with the North Korea is hand back the Pueblo. We want our ship back. We don't have North Korean war trophies. You don't get to keep the Pueblo. No. Then bring that ship back. Bring it to its home port. I think it was in Washington State. And then make it a museum there. So. But yeah, they deal with issues in general, though. They didn't do specific things of the day, because I'm going to talk about a few times they dealt with drug abuse. Well, there's always been drug abuse. Okay. Going back to Musk did a buzz of sniffing burlap. Okay, either or just spinning around the lawn until you fell down and see God. Oh yeah, Michael Piller. Michael Piller was Next Gen's answer to Gene Coon, because he was the writer, and then that's where you deal with shows that generally had one executive producer in the form of Gene Roddenberry, but you had producers like Rick Berman and Michael Piller. Rick handled the logistical stuff of it, and Michael Piller did the writing stuff. He was the real creative one. And it's like, by all rights, original series, Bob Justman should have been named producer, not co-producer, and then, probably shouldn't have even bothered bringing in Fred Freiberger. They should have just given the job to Bob Justman. Yeah. Okay, I wonder how much of a delay we're talking about here. Let's see. I'm gonna bring the sound thing back up. Okay. Here, bring that back up. There we go. Alright. Okay, it's when they're actually just called the cargo freighter Fortunate. Attacked by Nausicaans. I vaguely remember this one. Oh, we're talking major delay here. Alright. Okay, so I'm gonna go ahead. So we're waiting to catch up with the time delay here. So yeah. But yeah, I don't know. I don't know how you begin being a story editor on Picard without just pulling your hair out. But there's so much crap that's come out about what has been going on with this show. I mean, the Walter Mosley incident, especially, because like you have a very highly acclaimed writer, the kind of writer that Roddenberry would have killed to have on any of the shows, to get his perspective and his talent, and they just drive him out because some ninny can't handle hearing the N-word. In context of a story of what happened to the man. I was talking to the one they were after human resources, and they call me. We heard about you using the N word in the writers' room. I am the N word in the writers' room. It's, I'm not sure about the Herbert thing. I don't know that that may have been a reference to Hubert Humphrey, but But even then, it's this guy's not going to be in anything. So. Like we're talking a major delay here, so hopefully it's catching up here. But he's executive story editor. They have a story editor, believe it or not. And yeah, I'm running about a minute ahead of this. It's like this is so far behind, it's not even funny. But yeah. Ow. Let's see. Let me call up something here. Let's see. Oh, that's right. That's empty. Okay. Alright, we'll pull that. Alright. Never rats ass about that. Britain is planning to be completely out of the EU, and within, let's say, a month or so, if nothing goes weird. Monitoring the sound here, so no one to jump in on something. The president is going to be gone too, because they've already said no witnesses. They'll be acquitted by next week. There's going to be a big long gap here with no sound at all while I'm waiting for the thing to catch up here. But that's part of the thing of why the other shows have lasted, because they didn't try to be relevant to the times they were in. Well, it's been at this about an hour and a half. I'm going to time to wrap this up at this point. Pretty much like every era. They're constants. Yeah, the original series talked about, they alluded to the Vietnam War, but in the sense of war is bad in general. And they didn't specifically focus on Vietnam. The closest they got was a private little war, and again, Kirk is essentially arguing in favor of engagement, because they had to stay in there in order to maintain both sides and the balance of power argument. All right. But you'll never see anything. So I think at this point, probably better to just wrap us up here. And it's a starch equivalent of them going after LBJ. Declare this something of a qualified success, as chanted, because there's still some problems here with the delay and stuff. But the way to eat and deal with hippies, and that has aged badly. So I think because they're talking about the hippies, and it's like, okay, wait, you're a hippie episode. Now you've just firmly planted the show in the late 1960s. And well, I think the Enterprise kind of took inspiration from the Pueblo incident in '67. It didn't do a direct parallel of it, because actually that was rather horrific. I suggest tracking down that one. There was a TV movie, or actually, they were doing plays. ABC did back in the early '70s, called Pueblo, with Hal Holbrook, and it details the capture of the Pueblo, which is a spy ship, by North Korea, and what they went through. They still have the Pueblo anchored in the North Korean harbor there. And I think, the ultimate solution to some, treaty with North Korea is hand back the Pueblo. We want our ship back. They don't have North Korean war trophies. You don't get to keep the Pueblo. Bring that ship back. Bring it to its home port. I think it was in Washington State. And then make it a museum. Yeah, if it was an average sci-fi show, no. It would. Well, one, it wouldn't have lasted. It wouldn't have lasted all because there'd been a support for it. We recognize for the crap that is, and we cancel that right. But those two little words, Star Trek, in the title, give it a little bit of armor. So. A few times they dealt with drug abuse. Well, also, and then, but about the same token, the rules were different, so they wouldn't be had to say you did this wrong and that, because they make up their own rules. So maybe it'd fly, maybe it'd be recognized for the crap that's be chicken. Who knows? We'll never. Oh yeah, Michael Piller. Michael Piller was Next Gen's answer to Gene Coon, because he was the writer, and then that's where you deal with shows that generally have one executive producer in the form of Gene Roddenberry. But you had producers like Rick Berman and Michael. Let's see if I can catch up here. Both sides the balance of power. All right. But you'll never see anything at this point. Probably better just wrap us up here. Declare this something of a qualified success. Yeah, I think we're about ready to wrap this up here because it's. And that has aged badly. So I think we'll go ahead and use that. Get that back up. Okay, so. We're going for an hour and 40. It's mostly worked, so